If early reports are to be believed, intercontinental ballistic missiles have been used in combat for the first time in human history. The reports coming out actually of Kiev, Zelensky himself is claiming that an ICBM has been used from Russia into Ukraine carrying conventional warheads, which is an important distinction to make. But it's also very, very clear that these missiles that were allegedly used, and there is some interesting video to corroborate part of this, is that it could be exchanged for a nuclear payload if the Russians chose to do so. And to help try to make sense of what the meaning of this might be and where this war could be going, especially as we're now less than 2 months out from a new administration, we have back to the channel Professor John Mearsheimer, Professor of International Relations and a Professor of Political Science, rather, at University of Chicago, and International Relations theorist. John, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here, Danny.
Well, listen, I'm really glad I got you back on the show today because, man, a lot of the stuff that I'm seeing and what people are saying and positions of high power and authority is really puzzling to me. And we've been on a lot. We talk about disinformation and people saying things that are disconnected from reality. But I don't know. It seems like we're going into new territory here with some of the things that I'll be showing you today. But let's just get your initial comments here and your observation on what might be the intention of Russia using, whether it was an ICBM or an intermediate range, IRBM missile, almost doesn't matter because it is a nuclear capable missile used on Ukraine for the first time in the war. What is the significance of that?
I think the Russians are sending a signal here. You want to remember on almost the same day that President Biden announced that he would allow the Ukrainians to fire ATACMS into Mother Russia, the Russians formally announced that they had a new nuclear doctrine. Now, we knew what the broad outlines of that new nuclear doctrine were a few months ago, but it's no accident, in my opinion, that immediately after Joe Biden said that Ukraine could use ATACMS, that the Russians formally adopted that new nuclear doctrine, which, by the way, lowered the threshold for using Russian nuclear weapons. And I think this is another signal to the West that you're playing with fire. By using a ballistic missile, whether it's intercontinental or intermediate range ballistic missile, doesn't matter much. The fact is it's a missile that can carry nuclear warheads as well as conventional warheads. And the Ukrainians, of course, the Russians, of course, have not used such a weapon up to this point. The fact that they're using it now is a way of sending a signal to the West that you better not get too audacious in what you are willing to allow the Ukrainians to do, because there may be catastrophic consequences.
And what do you say to people like a retired General Jack Keane, who went on Fox News a couple of days ago and literally just dismissed this whole idea about nuclear escalation? He said, do you really think that Vladimir Putin is going to use a nuclear weapon when Trump is just 2 months away from coming in? Directly saying, don't worry about nuclear escalation. What do you say to that?
Well, he has no idea how Putin thinks about the use of nuclear weapons. He can't get inside Putin's head. And he also can't predict the circumstances that Putin is going to face over the next 2 months. I personally believe it's highly unlikely that Putin will use nuclear weapons. It's not because he would never use nuclear weapons in a situation that he viewed as dire for Russia. I think he would use nuclear weapons. But the fact is that Putin is in the driver's seat on the battlefield at this point in time. The Russians are doing very well. And the use of these ATACMS doesn't threaten Russia and Russia's fortunes on the battlefield in any meaningful way. So I don't think he's going to use nuclear weapons, period. But you want to be aware that that possibility is always there. And people like Jack Keane and others who dismiss that possibility are, in my opinion, making remarkably foolish comments, because we live in a nuclear world and one can never be certain that these weapons won't be used. And we want to act on that understanding, not on this argument that Putin would simply never use nuclear weapons.
I was speaking recently with a certain member of the U.S. diplomatic corps who claims that he has some Russian contacts that he has been unofficially talking with of late. And apparently, what's being reported is that there is growing discomfort and anger even in the Kremlin, at the Politburo, against Putin for not being more forceful in his retaliation with the West, and is putting more pressure on him to do more strong on the battlefield and possibly even use some of these missiles against targets at a higher level inside of Ukraine. And if any of these Storm Shadow missiles or ATACMs actually hit something of value in Russia, which they haven't so far. They've been fired, but they've either been knocked down or knocked away by electronic warfare methods. If there's something like the Russians are killed and something important is hit, then they may use conventional method weapons at first against targets even outside of Ukraine. To what degree do you give credence to those threats?
Well, look, there's no question that Putin for a long time has been criticized inside the Russian national security establishment for not being tough enough, for not waging this war vigorously enough. So this is not a new story. And Putin himself is self-critical for having trusted the West for so long. I believe that Putin thought that he could work out a deal in the wake of the Minsk Accords. I think that he thought he could work out a deal to end the war shortly after it started. He delayed a long time before mobilizing the Russian army to fight this war. He is self-critical of his behavior before the war and in the early stages of the war. And since he made some tough decisions like mobilizing 300,000 troops in September of 2022, he still continues to be criticized for not waging the war vigorously enough. So this is not a new story. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not at some point that pressure on him to up the ante, to escalate, is going to have an effect, and he's going to escalate in a significant way. I think there is no question that given the ATACMS decision and the fact that the British are also firing missiles into Mother Russia, that he's going to have to retaliate. How significant that retaliation is another matter. Because as you well know, Danny, the Russians are in the driver's seat. They're doing very well on the battlefield. And there's no real incentive, given the course of the war, for the Russians to change their behavior in a significant way, especially with the Trump administration coming in 2 months. So I don't think at this point that Putin is going to significantly up the ante. I think, however, if Trump comes in and Trump plays hardball or tries to play hardball with Putin, that at that point in time, I wouldn't be surprised if he did up the ante significantly.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to see how that's going to work out, because Trump has recently said that he is emphatically trying to de-escalate and wants an immediate ceasefire, et cetera. We'll, of course, see how that works out when he actually takes power on January the 20th. But and one of the targets of many, at least on the Russian media side, especially some of their Telegram channels, military channels, is that there's a lot of anger that they actually say, hey, Russia, Putin should go after Zelensky because he keeps making comments like this one.
Сьогодні була нова російська ракета. Всі характеристики, швидкість, висота міжконтинентальної балістичної. Зараз тривають експертизи. Очевидно, що Путін використовує Україну як полігон. Очевидно, що Путін боїться, коли поруч з ним просто є нормальне життя, коли люди просто мають гідність, коли країна просто хоче бути і має право бути незалежною. Путін робить все, що завгодно, тільки б не дати сусіду вирватись з його рук.
I'm not sure if you could read the small words on the text there, and for any of the others on a phone, you may not have. Basically, what he's saying is Russia's afraid of this. And actually, before that clip started, earlier in that same interview, which is earlier today, he said that Russia is desperate, and that's why they're going to help from Ukraine. To Iran, for North Korea, and now then they're escalating into this ICBMs, according to him, et cetera. And he goes, and the only thing is they just hate freedom and they hate us. There's no reason for them to be taking any action here. And a lot of people on the Russian side are saying, yeah, there is a reason, but he keeps making these comments. And I'm just curious as to your thought. At this time, now nearly 3 years into the war, do you think those kinds of statements actually have any influence on Western people?
No, I think that everybody or almost everybody who studies this war knows the Russians are not desperate, that the Russians are doing very well on the battlefield. I would note that there was an article in BBC the other day on the BBC website that said that there was a serious danger that the Ukrainian military would collapse. You want to think about that. BBC, mainstream Western media, is acknowledging the fact that there is a serious possibility. We're not saying it's likely. BBC was not saying it's likely, but they were saying there's a serious possibility that the Ukrainian military will collapse. That's a stunning statement. And that tells you that the Russians are not desperate, that the Russians are actually in a very good situation. There's no reason to think that the Russians are desperate. And this, by the way, is why I think that Putin is not going to rise to the bait from the West to escalate in some meaningful way, or to rise to the bait from Zelensky to escalate in some meaningful way. If he's smart, he'll just continue to wage the war pretty much the way he has been, and do everything he can to defeat the Ukrainians as quickly as possible and with as few casualties as possible.
Well, now let me ask you a question here, because there's a potential risk to that course of action if that's what Putin is doing, because it gives the impression that because of that really strong statement he made back in September about what would happen if if long-range weapons are used by the West, that they would take appropriate countermeasures, et cetera. And there's plenty of people in the West on the major media networks that keep saying it's just a bluff. He's never going to do it. And if now then weapons have been used and there is no reaction at all, that the West will continue to say, see, I told you, we can literally do whatever we want. And they'll continue to take action like that, which could be antithetical to Russia's interests. How does Putin navigate that challenge?
Well, there's no question that he has to send a signal to the West that what Biden has decided to do is unacceptable, because Putin did draw a red line. But the question is, what should the Russians do? And what they have done so far is they have formally adopted a new nuclear doctrine that allows for a lower threshold for nuclear use. And furthermore, they've now fired this ballistic missile. And I would imagine the Russians will do a handful of other things. For example, they could supply the Houthis and Hezbollah with all sorts of new weapons and give them a more formidable array of weapons to target the Israelis and the Americans with. There are a number of things that they can do. But my point is, I think the Russians would be foolish to overreact at this point in time. It's not necessary. Make it clear that they have responded, but don't change their behavior in any major way, because it's not necessary. As you know, Danny, I mean, we haven't talked about this. These ATACMs are not going to have any effect on what happens on the battlefield. The only reason that Putin really has to do something in response is because he did draw a red line and he has to send a deterrent message to the West. But in terms of effects on the battlefield, this hardly matters at all.
Right.
ATACMs are, what do they have? 50 ATACMs. They've already used 6 of them, so they have 44 ATACMs left. What are they going to do with 44 ATACMs? By almost all accounts, the Russians have launched somewhere on the order of 6,000 ballistic missiles in campaign over this war. As we all know, the Ukrainians are still fighting. Those 6,000 ballistic missiles didn't knock them out. What are 50 ATACMs going to do?
And that's assuming they actually get through, which apparently most of them have not, but I guess that's a separate issue. I want to zero in on something else that Zelensky brought up in his interview or his statement this morning, where he was mentioning the actions and the associations with Russia, North Korea, Iran, and recent reports are showing that actually China is helping in indirect ways for the Russian military, despite what has been claimed here. And at a press conference, I think it was the Secretary of State spokeswoman, Sabrina Singh, was asked, "Hey, aren't we already in World War III?"
Given the joint U.S. NATO escalation of attacks with Ukraine against Russia, and with China and North Korea joining Russia to form an alliance against the West, would not you say that World War III has begun?
I would not say that. That is not the characterization that this building assesses. And you've seen us take measures to de-escalate tensions and to and I'm sorry, I'm just speaking like broadly around the world, but when it comes to Ukraine, the commitment of this administration from the very beginning of this war was to help Ukraine take back its sovereign territory. A decision by another country to invade its sovereign neighbor cannot go unchecked. And that's why you've seen not just the United States, but 50 or so countries all around the world come together and support Ukraine through the Ukraine Defense Contact Group.
I said State Department. I meant the Pentagon, of course. That's our deputy press secretary. A couple of things from there. First of all, I found it very curious, especially in light of what she said at the last part about 50 nations coming together. She says, you know what? We've been taking a lot of measures to de-escalate. And I'm just wondering which of those measures about allowing long-range missiles or new landmines to be used into the theater of operations do you consider de-escalatory?
None of them. I mean, there's no evidence, if you look at the facts, that support her claim that we're trying to de-escalate in Ukraine. We refuse to basically negotiate with Putin. We're not interested in de-escalating. We continue to talk about bringing Ukraine into NATO, restoring the lost territory to Ukraine. I mean, I don't know what she's talking about.
And it's let's look at the genesis of the question, because he's saying, look, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and then according to Singh's own comments, 50 nations supporting Ukraine. I mean, this has the look of at least on the ground in Ukraine, it is a proxy war and direct war by those engagements, but it has the possibility of spilling over. How concerned are you that it could escalate into a broader war?
Well, I mean, it's very important to emphasize that what's happened here is that as a result of the Biden administration's foolish policies, we have clearly driven the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese close together. They now form a quite tight-knit bloc. And when you talk about the Americans, for example, getting into a fight with Iran, the Russians are in all likelihood going to be there in some form. It's quite clear that the Russians are providing the Iranians with defensive technologies and so forth and so on. So you see a link there. You see very close relations developing between North Korea and Russia. And in fact, there's all this talk about North Korean forces being in Russia and engaging in combat. The Russians and the Chinese have long been pushed together by our behavior in Ukraine. So you do have this tight-knit bloc. And one can hypothesize different scenarios where the Russians get pulled into a war involving Iran, for example. Or if a war were to break out between North Korea and South Korea, one can imagine both the Chinese and the Russians coming in on the side of North Korea and the Americans coming in on the side of South Korea. So anytime you have a tightly wound alliance or a tightly wound block of states like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, the possibility for escalation outside one theater into another theater is always present, and we have to be very careful. I do believe, though, Danny, having said all that, that it's not likely that we're going to have anything approximating a world war in the near future. And I certainly hope I'm right on that count, Prof.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope you're right on that as well. And so do all the regular citizens of the entire globe. I wanted to. I mentioned a minute ago that Russia has made some pretty strong declarations about what they're going to do after the missiles were authorized Sergei Lavrov was in a meeting where he directly commented on what Russia's actions could be.
Long-range missiles are going to be applied from Ukraine into Russian territory. It will also mean that they are operated by American experts, military experts. And we will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia, and we'll react accordingly.
And I think that probably, I guess, speaks to your comment there that they're not going to be rash, that they are going to be calculated and intelligent and not wanting to ramp things up and taking necessary actions that would naturally escalate the war to their disadvantage, because they are winning on the battlefield unequivocally. So I suppose that you would read that part anyway as confirming what you suggested already.
Yeah. I mean, you know, Danny, you and I have long argued that the principal cause of this war is that Russia views Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat. And it's very important to underline that word existential. From the Russian point of view, what's going on in Ukraine is of enormous strategic importance to them. They view their security, their survival as under threat. Now, the problem is that most people in the West, most people in the foreign policy establishment refuse to accept the argument that Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat to Russia. They instead believe that Putin is just a good old-fashioned aggressor. He wants to gobble up some territory. And if we can stop him and even push him back a bit, we can get him to the negotiating table. We can cut a deal. And that can be a temporary deal that we can rectify in 20 years when the Ukrainians are strong enough to take back the territory they've lost. But these people in the West, and they are the overwhelming majority, do not see Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat to Russia. They don't think Russia is operating as if they're facing an existential threat. And that's why people like Jack Keane don't think that Putin would use nuclear weapons. That is why they don't understand that using ATACMS is crossing a red line. And this really matters to the Russians. This is the nightmare scenario that they feared once Ukraine became a member of NATO. It was the whole idea that the Americans would be in a position to put missiles in Ukraine, and those missiles could hit Mother Russia. Well, that's exactly what's happening now. And again, from the Russian point of view, this is an existential threat. And what people in the West think about whether or not it is an existential threat is largely irrelevant. All that matters is what the Russians think.
Right.
The Russians, over time, this goes back to the famous Bill Burns memo, have made it manifestly clear that what is going on is an existential threat. So we are playing with fire here. But the only reason for a bit of optimism at this point in time, given the fact we're playing with fire, there is a bit of reason for optimism. And that is that these ATACMS just don't matter very much. And they're not going to slow the Russians down in any meaningful way. So therefore, the incentives for the Russians to escalate in a really serious way at this point in time does not appear to be there. But then again, this brings us back to the earlier discussion that you prompted, which is that there's a lot of pressure on Putin to get tough. People think he's been a softie. So you then begin to think maybe Putin at some point will be forced to escalate in a serious way just to deal with his domestic critics. Again, the bottom line here is we are playing with fire.
Right. And I think that it's also